Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be talking about the latest Pixar movie, Turning Red, and I thought it was alright. To give a brief spoiler free version of the review, I think that if you enjoyed Disney and Pixar's recent output, then this is largely more of the same, and I would highly recommend it to you. But I know there are people that have criticized Disney and Pixar's output for a while now, and for those people, this isn't going to convert them back. Now, to explain further, I will be going to spoilers, so if you haven't seen it and don't want to be spoiled, now is your opportunity to click out of this video. So first up, I think it's interesting to discuss this movie in light of Luca and Encanto coming out last year, as in some ways Turning Red is a combination of those two. Similar to Luca, it has a main character that can turn from human into a weird creature. Both films generally have a more slice of life feel for the most part, with the exception of the climax, but we'll get there. Both films have unconventional settings, with Luca taking place in Italy during the 1950s and Turning Red taking place in Toronto during the early 2000s. And neither film is a musical, which is something. Meanwhile, Turning Red shares Encanto's theme of generational trauma, where the family acts as an overarching structure that suppresses individuality and subsumes its members. For the most part, I appreciate these additions as I think it takes the more impressive elements from each film, with Luca's slice of life approach and Encanto's family dynamics, create something somewhat substantive. First, there's the slice of life genre, which I think Turning Red handles somewhat better than Luca. Admittedly, I think Luca was trying more to be a Miyazaki film, but was ultimately boring as I didn't care that much about the characters. This film generally tries to keep itself grounded, even if the stakes come off as grander with the threat of May being stuck with the panda forever, but we see a decent chunk of the film dedicated to May hanging out with her friends, while they're trying to make the most of this panda thing. The whole plot of them using the panda as a way to raise money to see some boy band is pretty interesting. And considering I'm going to be 24 in 2 months, I'm a bit of a sucker for 2000s culture. So seeing Tamagotchi, flip phones, and camcorders while hearing this in-sync Backstreet Boys group and May calling the statues Bart and Lisa kind of reminded me of my early childhood. I also have to note the film style. I mean, the first 20 minutes are filmed to the brim with quirkiness, doing what it can to set itself apart from other Disney and Pixar movies. Between May's introduction to the scene where her dad is cooking dinner, to her dread when her mom finds her journal and overreacts, it's something at least, although the rest of the film definitely tones it down and feels more like your typical Pixar output. Granted, with this style being in your face, I understand the need to dial it back as it could have gotten annoying after a while. Still, it's worth noting. Next up, I think the characters are good for the most part. I think May and her group of friends are particularly interesting. They're dorky and weird for the most part, while still being believable. I also enjoy May's mom, who is clearly the central source of conflict in this story. While she's technically the antagonist, I appreciate how the film conveyed her high expectations and controlling nature, while never crossing over into actual disappointment against May. To her, May is already quite successful, and she's quite proud of her. And even when May gets into bad situations, she always blames others rather than assume anything bad about May herself. I know there are going to be parallels between her and Abuela from Encanto and how they express themselves in front of their family, with obviously the main difference being that while Abuela internally sees Maribel as a disappointment, May's mom sees her daughter as a trophy for her quote-unquote successful parenting and validation of all the suppression she faced in her own upbringing to be a quote-unquote good girl and to pass that on to the next generation. And then there's a grandmother who turns out to be the root source of this entire dynamic. And similar to May's mom, I was pleasantly surprised and a little confused, but the grandmother also turned out to be sympathetic. There's a scar on her forehead, which foreshadows the reveal that May's mom attacked her during the Per Panda phase, which is fine, I guess. In general, the film goes out of its way to highlight how the grandmother doesn't see her over-controlling nature as over-controlling, but as a way of setting May on the right track. And there's also the scene where she tells May's mom to never let May out of her sight, which was interesting. But admittedly, I was a bit surprised there wasn't more of a confrontation between the mom and the grandmother. The climax focused squarely on the mom and May, despite us knowing that the chain of pressure can be traced back further. Ultimately, though, I am okay with this decision, as it can be inferred that the grandmother wasn't the first to impose it. As far as we know, this chain of trauma can be traced all the way back to the original ancestor with this ability. And considering the mom's unique position in the film, being both a victim and perpetrator of the trauma, addressing the latter effectively addresses the former as well. Plus, I think it makes the mom a more interesting character. So I think the movie does quite a bit right, and I have to commend it. However, there are also some issues I have. For me, the biggest annoyance on the offset is the premise. Really, this has been a problem for Pixar in general lately, where they have all these interesting stories and pretty good execution for the most part, only to shoehorn in some fantasy element designed to sell toys and fill up promotional material. People were saying this about Soul, where they could have simply told a story about a black music teacher trying to get his big break, only to throw in all the soul stuff. With Luca, it's even worse, where that could have easily just been about two human boys having misadventures, only for us to have all this sea monster stuff that felt pretty unnecessary. Now, you could say that this is all coming from Disney, and to Pixar's credit, I think they've generally done an okay job at incorporating these fantasy elements into the story and the themes, and this movie is no exception to that concept. But despite this movie's efforts to break the mold and feel different, this juggling act of mixing fantasy elements into human stories just makes it feel like every other Disney and Pixar movie that's come out in the last 5 years or so. Now, I know some people will say that this has always been Pixar's formula of taking these crazy concepts like talking toys, a monster society, and rats that can cook, and subverting our expectations to create these deep human stories. And people love that, I mean, myself included. But I think in recent years, we're kind of seeing this work in the opposite direction, where you have a human based premise and you want to tell a human story, only to have to shove in this fantasy element in order to check off a box and sell a toy at the Walmart. Now, as I alluded to earlier, this problem isn't as bad in this film as it is in Luca, but I'm left wondering how it could have played out if it didn't have to have all this panda stuff in it. Beyond that, there is some general dumb stuff as well. I mean, first, there's the whole thing where May first turns into the panda and she's trying to hide it while her mom assumes that she's having a period. And it only took her mom trying to break into the school and embarrassing her to the point where she turns into the panda that the mom gets a hint. And to me, a lot of this just felt kind of edgy. Like, that's something I didn't even mention earlier, is that this film definitely tries to be a bit edgier than some other Pixar films. I mean, characters say crap in it, and you have these ideas like thinking that May is having a period. So there's that. But anyway, after the mom finds out the truth, she reveals that the panda is a generational thing among the family's women. Now, doesn't that render all the period jokes pointless anyway? Like, how does it take the mom this long to realize that May turning into the panda was even a possibility? Later in the film, it's explained that the mom tried really hard to raise May right so the panda thing wouldn't happen, but you think she would have considered it earlier, considering May is around the same age she was when she had the panda. I don't know, that part felt dumb. It just felt there to throw in an edgy joke so that people will think that this film is more mature than some of the other Disney films that's come out recently. Later on, there's a quote unquote shocking reveal that May and her friends misread the flyer and that the concert is actually the same night as a ritual instead of a couple days before. Again, another dumb contrivance. Like, you're telling me that in all the time the girls were putting together this plan to raise money for tickets, they never once looked at the schedule? You're telling me they didn't hear any of their classmates talk about the concert and slip out the actual date? Come on. To me, this is something that could only work due to the film's very specific setting, where you have a city whose name looks very similar to that of another city in another neighboring country, and a time period where you don't have smartphones to instantly Google the concert date. But even then, it doesn't work that well. And of course, no movie like this would be complete without the all is lost moment, where May inevitably gets caught exploiting the panda for social gain and throws her friends under the bus in order to appease her mom. Now, at first, I was expecting this to happen after the concert. They'd raise the money and sneak out to go to the concert, and that's when May's mom finds out that she's been messing around with the panda and how that'll make it harder for the ritual to work. But by the way, that's never actually a factor in the movie. Like, you'd think that May turning to the panda over and over again would have caused complications when it came time for the ritual. So the fact that that doesn't really amount to anything is just kind of underwhelming in my opinion. And then the mom confronts him afterwards, or maybe she barges into the concert, kind of like what she tried to do at the school earlier or with the convenience store at the beginning. And that's when everything goes downhill. But once this Tyler kid approaches May with his party, how he could tell on her if he doesn't do what he says, and how he'll pay the last amount of money they need, it became clear that that would be the all is lost moment, while the concert would be the climax. Sure enough, that's what ends up happening, especially when the even more controlling grandmother just happens to show up the same day as the party. And to make matters worse, rather than waiting to confront May until she got home, the grandmother tells May's mom that she should keep an eye on her at all times, which prompts the mom to walk into the party right as May is about to maul Tyler for insulting her family. So, yeah, that all happens. If you saw my Oscar video, you probably figured that I'm not a huge fan of these all is lost moments showing up in all these movies, and this isn't much different. I mean, I get what they're trying to do in that May Tamale Tyler is meant to set up this metaphor of the panda representing all of May's imperfections, eventually leading to her decision to keep the panda. But it's still annoying that we have to sit through the same old scene where there's the big misunderstanding and everyone's moping and the film grinds to a halt while we wait for the moment where they snap out of it and open their mouths. And for all the three act structure purists out there, there's got to be a better way of getting from point A to point B without relying on all this moping and stopping the film for 15 minutes. But that's just my personal gripe. So, on the whole, Turning Red is a decent film for what it is. Like most other Pixar films, it's gotten overwhelming praise from critics, and it's probably going to be a contender during next year's award season. And while I just spent the last few minutes talking about its problems and downplaying its overall significance, I genuinely enjoyed my viewing experience with this movie. I like these characters, I like the setting, and I can appreciate its themes regarding generational trauma, high expectations, and being authentic. And compared to more recent Disney and Pixar films, I do find it impressive. While I can't say it's better than Soul or even Toy Story 4, I enjoyed it more than Luca, Incredibles 2, and Cars 3. Even so, I don't think this film changes the landscape for Pixar or Disney. For people that believe Pixar peaked with Toy Story 3 and hasn't recovered since, and there are plenty of them, Turning Red will not change their minds. For them, it has the same tired tropes that hold back the story and themes. For people that believe Pixar has always been great, Turning Red is more of the same and stands out compared to its more direct predecessor. However, I'll be curious to see how many of them consider this one of their favorites 5 years from now. As for me, I think it's pretty good and in the top half of Pixar's movies since Toy Story 3, but it's certainly not groundbreaking. So that's it for the video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. I really want to make more of these film videos moving forward, talking about different movies from Pixar and DreamWorks and all these animation studios moving forward, on top of covering other shows that I've been covering on this channel up to this point. I do enjoy making these type of videos and hope that you all enjoy it. But for now, that is the video. See ya.